Hi everybody and welcome back to another episode of Jesus Is. My name is Pat Gunning. I'm the youth minister at Sacred Heart Church in Ocean Beach in San Diego, California. And this Sunday we have the Feast of Corpus Christi, which remembers the institution of the Eucharist as a sacrament. And so this Sunday's gospel, Jesus proclaims that he is the bread of life, that he is the bread that has come from heaven. Now, up until this point, if you had asked the Jews what is the bread from heaven, they would tell you about the story about how the Israelites were once slaves in Egypt, and then God freed them from their slavery in Egypt and led them through the desert for 40 years. And then he rained down bread from heaven to feed them for all their days while they were in the desert. And so this was, up until this point, what they saw as the bread from heaven. So Jesus, in his ministry, at one point, gives this bread of life discourse. And this story happens in the Gospel of John, right after the multiplication of the loaves and fishes. And so right after he feeds all these people, Jesus gives them this bread of life discourse, this sermon, if you will, a homily, just like we see at Mass, right? And following the meal, Jesus speaks to them about bread from heaven. And he refers to himself as bread from heaven, which was kind of odd to the Israelites because they're like, isn't bread a object and aren't you a person? And he said that he would offer his body and blood for the nourishment of the soul. But unlike their ancestors who died, Jesus was offering them food of everlasting life. And so they questioned him, asking him to show them that he was God. And Jesus said, I am the bread of life. He who comes to me shall not hunger, and he who believes in me shall never thirst. And so the crowd didn't like this answer because it's like, you're the bread of life? I don't know how that will sit with our people. And they keep pestering him. They keep asking him. They're like, do you really mean that? Like, that sounds a little too literal. I don't know if you really mean that. Let me just make sure that you didn't mean that. And every time Jesus gets more and more specific. So Jesus said, I am the living bread which came down from heaven. If anyone eats of this bread, he will live forever. And the bread which I shall give for the life of the world is my flesh. So Jesus is being very, very specific. He's being very literal. And he says, your ancestors ate the manna in the desert, but they died, right? It only lasted so long. And he says, this bread comes from heaven so that one may eat it and not die. So the Jews disputed it amongst themselves. And so Jesus took it even further. And this is where we get to the gospel that we have this Sunday, because the bread of life discourse is like 70 something verses long, and the church is very compassionate and merciful on us and not having us read the entire thing. But if you want to go back, you can read the whole John chapter 6 to yourself and see how this all plays out. But the part that we read this Sunday, the Jews are disputing, and Jesus takes it further, and they're amazed and they were disturbed by Jesus' teaching, and they left. And only the 12 apostles were left. And even they said, this is a hard teaching. Who can accept it? And Jesus asked them if they wanted to leave too. And they said, Lord, to whom shall we go? You have the words of eternal life. We have come to believe and to know that you are the Holy One of God. They didn't understand Jesus' teaching, but they had faith nonetheless. They knew that he was God and that what he was saying must be true. And they would more fully understand his teaching at the Last Supper. And this very much speaks to us too. We may not fully understand the beauty and the holiness and the sacramentality of the Eucharist, or many other aspects of our faith, right? Last week we talked about the Trinity and how that's the central mystery of our faith. And we can't fully understand it here on earth. And that's okay. God doesn't expect us to fully understand it here on earth. But we can have faith and do our best to understand and keep asking questions and praying and being led closer to God. And we have these things revealed to us. So these apostles, they didn't understand Jesus' teaching, but they said that they would continue to follow him. But everybody else left because they couldn't accept this teaching. How could you tell us to eat your flesh and your blood and drink your blood? That doesn't make any sense. It's cannibalistic, really. But this leaves us with two things. One, the Eucharist is a spiritual food, which gives us the graces that we need for everlasting life. And two, the Eucharist it truly is the body and blood of our Lord Jesus Christ. Not just a symbol, not just a nice gesture, not just this is something that Jesus did in his time, and so we commemorate that, and the church is so traditional. Isn't that great? No, it's literal. Jesus is like, if for nothing else, it's because this is my body and my blood, so do that. The Eucharist is different than all other sacraments in this way, and it's that the bread and the wine actually become the body and blood of Christ. Again, not just symbols. They actually become it, along with Jesus' soul and divinity. At baptism, water becomes holy water, okay? But it's still water. It's still only water that's holy. But the appearance of the Eucharist may be bread and wine, but it is now, in fact, the body and blood of Christ. And this is a word that we call transubstantiation, which means the changing of a substance, because it's literally changing the substance of bread and wine into body and blood. Now, the miracle comes in, the faith comes in, where Jesus keeps what we call accidents of the bread and wine. That is, it still tastes like bread and wine, it still looks like bread and wine, it still smells like bread and wine, it still feels like bread and wine. And all these things, it still has all the accidents of bread and wine. But what it is, the substance of it, it is now, in fact, Jesus' body and blood. And so we could say, well, why doesn't he just literally turn it into his flesh and blood, and look like it? Why doesn't he change the accidents too? Well, one, that would probably be really gross to go to Mass and have to receive like a finger or a toe or whatever of Jesus. Be very strange. I feel weird even just saying it. But Jesus is like, okay, that'd be weird and gross. And you don't want to turn people away from the faith, because it's like, oh yeah, that faith, you have to like drink real blood and eat real flesh. Kind of weird. Jesus knows this. He knows us. But also he's calling us to faith in this way. That because even though it still looks like bread and wine, and we know it is not, it takes faith to believe that and to know that to be true. So a few things about the Eucharist is that the whole of Christ is present in the Eucharist. All of Jesus is right there in that host and right there in that chalice of blood. The whole of Christ is present in every part of the Eucharist. Every little speck of the Eucharist, or every little drop of the blood, is the whole of Christ. Every part of Christ is there, even when the parts are divided. When the priest breaks the Eucharist in two or into four parts, every part of those now, it's not, you have 1/2 or 1/4 of Jesus. No, you still have the wholeness of Jesus in that piece. So those of you who think if you get that one piece of the big one, it's okay. That's still the whole of Jesus. The presence of Christ is sacramental, right? The sign is the bread and the wine. And finally, the presence of Christ endures as long as the appearance of bread and wine remain. So literally, as long as it is there, it is still Jesus. It doesn't wear off after an hour or at the end of the day or at the end of the fiscal year. It's still truly Jesus' body and blood as long as it remains. So the first account we see of the Mass being celebrated is in the letter of St. Paul to the Corinthians. And he says, as often as you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes. Now, this is a line that probably a lot of us are familiar with because we hear it at Mass every single time we go to Mass. But this is a quote by St. Paul, and he's saying this to the Corinthians because he's telling the Corinthians, who are a group of people, and he's also telling us, the church, that every time you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes again. Which means when one eats the food which has been sacrificed, we also participate in the sacrifice itself. And this brings us to this Sunday, where we finally, after 3 months of being in quarantine, get to participate in the holy sacrifice of the Mass. That we are not just coming back to Mass, okay, great, it's great to see everybody again, I can fulfill my Sunday obligation. It is so much more than that, and it's always been so much more than that. But especially now as we come back after 3 months away, that we come back and we remember and we come in wholeheartedly seeing what's really happening. This isn't just our Sunday obligation. This isn't just what you do to be a good person. It's everything about our faith. It's everything about our lives. It's everything about our eternity. And we need to remember that this is a sacrifice that happened 2,000 years ago and is also happening right now as we're participating in it. Every time we eat of this bread and drink of this cup, we proclaim the Lord's death until he comes again. we're proclaiming it to the world, to the church before us, and to everybody that we go out after Mass to tell about. So let's go into this Sunday, the Feast of Corpus Christi. What an awesome feast to come back on as we celebrate the institution of the Eucharist, and in a new way, a sort of reinstitution of it in our hearts. And that we may never forget the importance, the centrality of the Eucharist in our faith. I hope you all have a really blessed week. God bless.